Web3 Foundation is funding the prize fund. It's a fairly substantial fund. It's 10 million dot. So I think at the moment that's about 70 million US. And it'll be split in certain ways. It's not really finalized yet. But basically, we'll set it up so lots of different implementations are incentivized, many different languages, and we want to incentivize people that maybe don't. We want to get people onboarded, right? So we want to make sure that while the prize for developing something that is conformant and performant enough to run Polkadot as a validator node is really nice and high, we also want to have smaller prizes to get people just starting to write implementations and getting to the point where they can synchronize a chain and import some blocks. I mean, ideally, I don't think we're going to see a jam launch by the end of the year, but if we look to Ethereum and the evolution of the yellow paper as a guide, and I think it's not a terrible guide. Ethereum was in development for about 6 months before the design of Ethereum was being mooted for about 6 months before the yellow paper was published. And Jam is about the same. The design of Jam has been mooted for about 6 months, and by about the same number of people as well. I think there may be 3, 4, 5 in Ethereum that were really thinking about implementing this, reading the spec properly, and writing code. And after the yellow paper was published, it was about 5 or 6 months before we landed on something that could be considered something that looked like what was eventually launched. Basically, auditing of the Ethereum protocol started at the end of the year, end of 2014, early 2015. I think technically it started January 2015. So yeah, around 6 months after the yellow paper was published, 7 months, 8 months, something like that. And it slowed down the incremental changes obviously slowed down quite a lot towards the end. So I think we're going to have something roughly by the end of the year that we're happy with. And I would really hope that we can get something even sooner than that. And I would hope to have 2 or 3 implementations kind of following along, and maybe a few other implementations lagging behind a bit, but ready to really speed up once there's a final draft. So I would hope final draft of the grey paper, end of the year. Notwithstanding any audits that happen afterwards and changes that need to be done because of that. And then maybe we aim for a sort of midsummer jam launch next year. I mean, again, I don't want to. I mean, yeah, exactly. That whole migration and launch thing. Maybe that's. Yeah. And this isn't idle speculation. I'm really just basing it off the timeline that Ethereum followed. So the idea with governance is, yeah, relay chain stops, jam chain starts, everything gets migrated over, and then there's dots. The dots are, instead of being but they're still on the parachains, basically. The idea will be that the dots that sit on the relay chain at the moment, or before jam chain, immediately before the jam chain migration, those dots would move into either a sort of relay chain parachain that just copies the balances over, or maybe more likely the asset hub. And then those balances just get added to the asset hub, or possibly the staking chain. That's the other thing. So then the relay chain would just turn into the staking chain. This is yet to be determined, and there are people working on it. Joe Petrovsky is working on this sort of full time. This idea of getting rid of the relay chain and moving all of its functionality into the parachains. The DOT token itself and all the balances would be just moved over, and there'd be no real change, no change in terms of who held what tokens. Now, there is a question of the DOT token economics. And this, I'd say, is a secondary question for governance, but one equally valid and equally interesting to talk about. At the moment, the dot token economics were basically, largely pie in the sky, 10% issuance year on year, with that issuance being used to pay for a mix of the staking rewards and the treasury funding. There's already a thing, I don't know if the code has been done yet, but there's already I think, accepted RFC to change that so that it's always 2% that goes to the treasury and 8% that goes to staking. I think it's worth having a conversation about whether long term we want something that is more economically stringent. I think there are good reasons to constrain economics and make them hard to alter. And the economics would ultimately, I think, in my imagination anyway, sit on the jam chain. So it would be the jam chain that issues new tokens, or that controls the issuance of tokens. And the jam chain would not be a inherently upgradable chain, right? It's not built with substrate and doesn't have this WASM thing. Now, the services that sit on the jam chain, including all the parachains, are inherently upgradable. So actually, we don't lose much in terms of upgradability from what we have at the moment. But I think it's an interesting proposition to say the economics should not be inherently upgradable. Maybe a hard fork happens and it does change, but that's a harder thing to bring about. It's reasonable to say, right, well, we've been going for a few years now. We have a pretty clear idea about token economics. We have a much better understanding about proof of stake token economics than we did when Polkadot was launched, 3, 4, 5 years ago. Kusama, was 2019, 5 years ago. Polkadot 2020, 4 years ago. Let's decide and sort of fix something, and that gives a greater level of certainty for future. And certainty is broadly speaking a good thing if it doesn't come at a significant cost of flexibility. And I'm not convinced we need that flexibility at this stage. We haven't changed this 10% issuance for a very long time. Implying, in fact, we haven't changed the economics, really. Apart from this one RFC, we haven't changed the economics at all. Implying to me that we don't need that flexibility. And therefore, I think a degree of certainty may be very helpful, or may not come at a significant cost, I should say, significant opportunity cost. What would it look like? Well, it could look like all sorts. It could just be that it bakes in this 10% a year. I think a more interesting one, though, would be to look towards if we see, I used to think step curves were a silly thing humans did or a silly thing humans did accidentally. I now see step curves, and when I say step curves, I don't know if you know what I mean, but curves that don't go in a nice curvaceous fashion, but rather look like a staircase. A very good example of a step curve is the tax system, right? It's like you get taxed some amount until you reach this amount, and then you get taxed some amount more until you reach this amount, and then you get taxed some amount more. It looks very much like, if you draw it out on it as a graph, it looks very much like this staircase. Now, I thought up until quite recently, these different thresholds had no hidden value. They were really just people couldn't handle complicated, mathematical formula, right? They had to fall back on if X then Y, if A then B, if and then the very, very basic heuristics rules. I think And so as mathematicians or as people, theoreticians, when we design systems like this, cryptoeconomic systems, we tend to design them with, nice mathematical curves in, because they're more tractable. They're more theoretically reasonable. You can reason about them better theoretically. Steps, they're very hard to reason about theoretically, because you have to kind of reason about, you have to transfer this step into all of the theoretical dimensions that you want to analyze it in. Very hard. And so we end up with, I end up thinking to myself, well, actually, maybe it's sensible. One of the notable things about Bitcoin is the step curve, this halvening every 3 years, the Bitcoin issuance rate halves. Now, what's that about? Like, why not just make it on a nice curve? Why have these discrete events? Step. 50%, 25%, 12.5% Bitcoin. Why make it a step? There is a very, very useful thing about a step that I hadn't realized. It is a Schelling point. It's a natural point that humans can use to form agreement. It's not that it forces them into agreement, but it gives them this default point of agreement. And it turns out this can be very useful in economic systems, to have a very default, or in general social systems, to have a very default point of agreement. You don't necessarily want to force it, because forcing it means that it can potentially then be used as a point of attack. But if it's just a default point, it means that people aren't being coerced or forced into doing particular behavior. It's just what they do. If there's no reason not to do it, then it can really help. And steps are Schelling points. As a very simple example, it's like the steps in Bitcoin form Schelling points of market activity. People do more stuff around the time of the step. Now, there are ancillary reasons why they do stuff, but that doesn't explain all of the market activity, right? But those ancillary reasons have knock-on effects, and those knock-on effects, together with the expectation, give people a reason to do an action that they otherwise don't have any reason to do at some point or another point. It creates waves. And it creates consensus, and it creates coherency. And these can all be very useful things. I think overall, it's an interesting question, not one that I'm necessarily convinced on yet, but I think it's an interesting question, and I've been asked it from a few different people, whether it might be sensible to bring in such economic Schelling points into a Polkadot issuance scheme. If we want to make Polkadot less inflationary, not deflationary, but perhaps disinflationary. So a system whereby the amount of inflation reduces over time. Then this would look something like one way that this could look like, could look, I think is something that I don't know if it got deployed, but it's definitely something that we talked about a lot during the Ethereum days, which was that you take an amount that is some percentage of issuance at some particular point, and you just add that amount every time. So that as an overall percentage, that amount goes down. So you are disinflationary. Your inflation is reducing in terms of the percent, but it's never deflationary. You're never getting to zero. You're just fixing the amount that you're adding to the system. An example of a disinflationary system would be gold mining. If all of the mines were discovered and there were only a certain amount of mining equipment in the world. So it's like you can mine, a ton of gold a year, but you will always mine a ton of gold a year, but you'll never mine more than a ton of gold, never mine less than a ton of gold. And if there's 1,000 tons of gold in the world today, then that represents 0.1% inflation of gold, right? But next year, it represents a slightly lower percentage of inflation. It's still the same 1 ton that you're mining. It's just there's more gold in the world that it's being added to. So that's one possibility. There is also the possibility of doing something a little bit more aggressive that would result in Bitcoin-style discontinuities in the issuance curve, which would be something along the lines of state what the maximum amount is. So, for example, I think we're at about 1.5 billion, 1.4 or 5 billion. I haven't looked recently, but roughly this amount in DOT, as far as I recall. Take that amount and let's say double it. So suppose by the time Jam is launched, we're at 1.7 billion. So suppose the time Jam's launched, we're at 1.57 billion, right? Roughly. Just to do 2 decimal places. Then what we do is we double that to get something roughly pi, 3.14-ish, right? And we say that's the total amount, pi billion, that's the total amount that will ever be minted of DOT, right? And then we say, we take what's left, so we subtract from that pi billion the amount that's already been issued. So in the case of Jam, when Jam launches, it'll be like 1.5, let's say 1.57 billion. We subtract it and we end up with about 1.57 billion. And then we divide that by, I don't know, let's say 12, 15. And we say, right, for the next year, that's the amount that gets paid out. It so happens that the numbers are such that, let me think, 1.5. Yeah, the numbers are such that if you divide that amount by, if you say 10%, we take 10% of that and we pay that out over the next 12 months, that would mean no reduction in rewards for that first year, right? Now, after that's been paid out, because it's like 1.5, 10% of 1.5 is billion is 150 million, and that's what would have been provided if you just do 10% of the total amount issued, right? Still the same thing. Now, in the following year, you would take 10% of what's left, right? So that would be less than 1.5. That would be 1.3 or something. 1.35-ish, 1.4, something like that. So it'll go down a little bit. And then the year after that, 10% of what's left. And that would go down a little bit. Less than the year before, but like it will go down. It will go down, but it wouldn't go down as much as it went down from the first to the second year. And you do that each year, and it sort of follows a curve like this, except it would be year on year, so it would step each year. This could be interesting. And then you know, if you say, well, 12 months, we don't want a 12-month thing, we want a 9-month thing, or we want a 15-month or an 18-month thing or whatever. That's also possible. You know, you can just fiddle around with the numbers. This model, I think, is kind of an interesting one. It provides a nice, very shallow curve going from the rewards that are happening at the moment into a fixed final amount model that isn't too aggressive. And it's like, if it turns out to be too aggressive, then you do a hard fork and you say, right, well, we're gonna add more. And you can measure this by saying, you know, by validators, and you can have a soft governance edict that says the amount that Polkadot should, be securing things by in terms of fiat should never be less than 100 million, billion, 2 billion, whatever. So you pick a number, you just say, right, the amount at stake should always be at least this in fiat. And if the staking system isn't enough to to guarantee that, then it's like we agree ahead of time to a hard fork that would alter it, increase it so that it's more likely to be able to do that.
It's almost got a safety mechanism.
Exactly. Yeah. I think this would be a very interesting possibility. I think as long as there's like this safety mechanism, I don't really see any big downsides. I do see a serious upside, which is that you've got fiscal certainty, right? And you've got this funny shelling point, which might also add a bit of value. I mean, I don't know if it really would, but people like shelling points. Yeah, people like Pi Day, March 14th. People like April the 1st. People like Shrove Tuesday. They like Valentine's Day. People like these specific points.
Having a formal specification is to underline the fact that Jam is a protocol. It's not a piece of software. If you want to see more about the Grey Paper, go to greypaper.com.